Priscilla Presley finally admits what she did, with Leslie Nielsen behind the scenes. The first time Priscilla Presley met Leslie Nielsen, she probably expected a normal introduction. Instead, he reached into his pocket and set off a whoopee cushion. And somehow, that ridiculous little prank became the beginning of one of the warmest friendships of her career. What happened between them on the set of The Naked Gun wasn't some secret romance or Hollywood scandal. It was something much more human, two people who had spent years being underestimated, suddenly discovering that they could make each other laugh. When I came across Priscilla's own recollections of those days, one thing stood out to me. She didn't remember Leslie as a famous comedian first. She remembered him as the person who made it impossible for her to keep a straight face. And that matters, because Priscilla Presley wasn't exactly walking onto that set with years of comedy experience behind her. By the time The Naked Gun came around, the public already knew her name. But most people knew it because of Elvis. Priscilla had met Elvis when she was just 14, while her family was stationed in Germany. Their relationship eventually led her to Graceland, marriage in 1967, and the birth of their daughter Lisa Marie. But after the marriage ended, Priscilla had something much harder to do than simply move on. She had to figure out who she was when she wasn't being introduced as Elvis Presley's wife. That's part of what makes her story with Leslie Nielsen so interesting. Because Leslie understood something about being underestimated too. For decades, he'd been the serious guy, the handsome actor, the dependable supporting performer. He had appeared in respected dramas and films like Forbidden Planet, but comedy wasn't what audiences expected from him. Then, in 1980, Airplane changed everything. At 54, Nielsen suddenly discovered that the thing he'd spent his entire career doing seriously, playing completely straight, was exactly what made him hilarious. And I think that's one of the strangest career turnarounds in Hollywood. Most actors spend their youth trying to become stars. Leslie Nielsen became one after people had already started assuming his biggest opportunities were behind him. Then came Frank Drebin, and eventually, The Naked Gun. Priscilla was brought into the movie as Jane Spencer, a role that would introduce her to an entirely different kind of acting. She wasn't surrounded by dramatic scenes anymore. Now, she had to keep a straight face while Leslie Nielsen delivered completely absurd material as if it were the most serious thing in the world. And apparently, that was much harder than it sounds. Priscilla later described how difficult it was to get through scenes with him. Leslie would start laughing. Then she'd start laughing. Then the cameras had to stop. Take after take. That's the part I find fascinating. Because Leslie's entire comedy style depended on everyone around him behaving as though nothing unusual was happening. But Priscilla kept breaking. She couldn't help it. And eventually, the joke wasn't just what Leslie was saying. The joke was that these two actors were desperately trying not to laugh at each other. Priscilla later recalled that Leslie would sometimes cry from laughing, while the director tried to bring everyone back under control. She even admitted that she was good at making him laugh too. That tells you something about their relationship. It wasn't simply Leslie teaching Priscilla comedy. They were feeding off each other's energy, and behind the scenes, that became a genuine friendship. Leslie reportedly carried that famous whoopee cushion with him and used it to break the tension with people. When he met Priscilla, he pulled it out. She didn't know how to react. Then Leslie started laughing, and suddenly, the awkwardness disappeared. That tiny moment may sound silly, but imagine Priscilla's life at that point. For years, people had looked at her and seen Elvis Presley. Now she was trying to establish herself as an actress. And instead of treating her like someone who needed to prove herself, Leslie simply made her laugh. No pressure. No grand speech, just a ridiculous prank. Sometimes that's how friendships actually begin. Not with some dramatic conversation, just one person making the other person feel comfortable enough to be themselves. And Leslie had his own reasons for understanding that feeling. His childhood had been difficult, and he had also dealt with significant hearing loss from a young age. He later spoke about how difficult acting could be when you couldn't always hear your cues. Yet he built a career anyway. And then, after decades of waiting, he became one of America's most recognizable comedy stars. The Naked Gun was a huge success. Then came The Naked Gun 2.5 and The Naked Gun 33/3. Priscilla and Leslie returned together, and their chemistry became part of what audiences loved about the movies. But here's what I think gets lost when people only remember the jokes. For Priscilla, Leslie wasn't simply Frank Drebin. He was the colleague who made work fun. She later described him as generous, talented, and someone who was always teaching her something new. That's a pretty powerful thing to hear from someone who worked with so many famous people. And when Leslie died in 2010, Priscilla's reaction wasn't just a standard Hollywood tribute. She remembered the friendship. She remembered the laughter. She remembered how much fun he made the workplace. That's probably the real secret behind what Priscilla did with Leslie behind the scenes. She laughed. A lot. She broke character. She tried to keep a straight face and couldn't. And somewhere between those ruined takes and ridiculous pranks, she found a friend. Years later, when Priscilla returned for the 2025 Naked Gun reboot, she shared the news with fans and wrote, "Over 35 years later, the laughs continue." I love that line. Because after everything that had happened in the decades between those films, she still connected that franchise with laughter. Not scandal, not gossip, not some hidden Hollywood affair. Laughter. And maybe that's the part of Priscilla Presley's story worth remembering most. She spent years trying to step outside somebody else's shadow. Leslie Nielsen spent years waiting for Hollywood to recognize what he could really do. They met at exactly the right moment. And instead of competing, judging, or taking themselves too seriously, they made each other laugh. Sometimes the most important people in our lives don't arrive with dramatic entrances. Sometimes they walk up, pull a whoopee cushion from their pocket, and completely ruin your ability to keep a straight face.